Since childhood, I learned that the world was not a kind place. My mother always said that for someone like me, there would be no shortcuts, only choices. I could either accept reality as it was or shape it with my own hands. I chose the latter. I grew up in a small apartment in the suburbs where bills piled up faster than my mother could pay them. She worked as a seamstress, pulling double shifts to ensure I could study. I watched her calloused hands glide the fabric under the needle, stitching dreams that would never be hers. That left a mark on me. I wanted more. Not luxury, not empty wealth, but power. The power to never again have to accept less than I deserved. I was the best student in school, earned a scholarship to one of the country's most prestigious universities, and graduated before turning 23. While my classmates were still figuring out their paths, I was already carving mine. My first investment was small, a promising tech project that no one took seriously. I did. 2 years later, I sold my share and turned a few thousand into millions. It was during this time that I met Raphael. He appeared as if straight out of a romance novel designed to disarm me. Tall, charming smile, captivating gaze. It didn't take long for me to fall in love, and for a while, I was happy. But love can be treacherous when you're surrounded by people who don't want you to belong. That's how I met Adelino and Esther Ferraz. At first, they maintained the facade of cordiality. Esther's smile never reached her eyes, and Adelino's handshake was as cold as metal. I knew they judged me, the daughter of a seamstress, a young and successful woman. To them, I was nothing more than an opportunist who had infiltrated their family for convenience. It didn't matter how much I tried to prove otherwise. When Raphael and I got married, the tone of our relationship changed. Esther began, subtly, excluding me from important family events. The veiled comments soon became open. Small cuts, an irony here, a sneer there. Raphael didn't see it, or chose not to. He said it was all in my head, that I should ignore it. Then came the company. The Ferraz empire was not as solid as it seemed. Debts were piling up, contracts were falling apart. I saw the crisis approaching like an inevitable storm. Raphael, insecure and under pressure, started asking for my advice. At home, he admitted that his parents were losing control of the company. But when I suggested that I could help, I saw the final barrier crumble. They didn't want my help. They wanted to see me fail. That's when I understood. It didn't matter how much I had achieved through my own merit. It didn't matter how much Raphael trusted me. To Adelino and Esther, I would always be the outsider. I would always be the woman trying to steal what was theirs. But fate has a cruel sense of humor, because what I never wanted would soon be exactly what remained. And they had no idea. The boardroom was large, imposing, decorated with dark wood furniture and paintings that flaunted the grandeur of the Ferraz empire. But at that moment, it all seemed like a decaying theater. I sat at the table, maintaining a firm posture. Across from me, Adelino Ferraz stared at me as if I were an intruder in his fortress. Esther, sitting beside him, crossed her arms, looking at me with an air of superiority that no longer affected me. They knew the company was on the brink of collapse. Perhaps they didn't know the full extent of the crisis, but they could feel the ground crumbling beneath their feet. And yet, their pride kept them from admitting it. I took a deep breath, carefully choosing my words. I explained that I had conducted a detailed analysis of the latest financial statements, identified where the biggest losses were, and had developed a strategy to reverse the situation. It was a solid plan, designed to restore market credibility, attract new investors, and stabilize operations. Silence was their first response. A silence heavy with tension, interrupted only by the sound of Adelino's fingers tapping on the table. He didn't look impressed, nor interested. Esther's gaze narrowed, and then came the first burst of venom. "So this is it? You think you can sit here and tell us how to run our own company? Do you even know what it means to build something from the ground up?" I kept my face expressionless. They didn't want a plan, they wanted someone to blame. If you knew how to listen, you'd understand that I'm not telling you how to run it. I'm telling you how to avoid bankruptcy. Adelino's scornful laughter echoed through the room. You think we understand so little about our own business? You, who came from nothing, think you can teach us something? Your little game ends here. My patience, until then intact, started to wear thin. I didn't need to be there. I didn't need their validation, their acceptance. If I was offering help, it was because I knew what was coming. All right, was all I said, pushing back my chair and standing up. But Esther wasn't done. My son didn't deserve a tramp like you, a gold digger. The room froze. Raphael, who had remained silent until then, lowered his head. Not even he had the courage to intervene. I could have fought back. I could have raised my voice, could have let them see that their words affected me. But instead, I simply smiled. They didn't understand. They didn't understand that their pride wouldn't save them when the doors closed. They didn't understand that their company was no longer an empire, but a ruin about to collapse. They didn't understand that the worst revenge doesn't come from anger, but from patience. I walked out of that room without looking back. 5 minutes later, my phone was to my ear and my voice was firm. Start the operation. They had no idea what was about to happen. Esther's words still echoed in my mind, but not in the way she intended. I wasn't hurt. I wasn't furious. I was analyzing, calculating. Her and Adelino's contempt no longer affected me because now I saw everything clearly. They had no power over me. All they had left was the arrogance of those who had already lost but hadn't realized it yet. As I stepped out of that meeting, the cold night air hit me like a reminder. It was a night like any other, but they didn't know that for them, this would be their last night of peace. I returned home, and Raphael was already waiting for me. He was sitting on the couch, his expression closed off, as if trying to find the right words. I already knew what was coming. My mother overreacted, he said hesitantly. But you didn't have to provoke her. You know how she is. I looked at him and realized something obvious, something I had perhaps refused to admit before. He would never be on my side. Never. I provoked her? I repeated with an ironic smile. Do you think offering help is a provocation? He ran his hands over his face, exhausted. You know what I mean. They're under pressure. My father has been running this company for years. You can't just come in and act like you know more. But I do know more. He lifted his gaze to me, surprised by the firmness in my voice. I know more, Raphael, and you know it too. If your father were truly a great businessman, you wouldn't be on the verge of losing everything. He opened his mouth to argue, but closed it immediately, because deep down, he knew I was right. But admitting that would mean breaking a cycle he never had the courage to question. I let the silence settle between us before picking up my phone and stepping away. My contact answered on the first ring. Are the conditions ready? Ready. As soon as you give the signal, the market will react as expected. It was simple. Over the past few weeks, I had studied every weakness of the Faraz company. They were hanging by a thread. All I needed to do was cut that thread at the right moment. Initiate the protocol, I ordered. Are you sure? After this, there's no turning back. Exactly. I hung up and slipped the phone into my pocket. When I returned to the living room, I found Raphael still sitting there staring at the wall as if waiting for some answer to appear. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. The game had already begun. They just didn't know they had already lost. The next morning, the market had already responded. Faraz Imports stocks opened lower. A small, subtle drop, but significant. From an outsider's perspective, it might seem like just a regular fluctuation, but I knew it was the beginning of something much bigger. The media began whispering about financial difficulties. A strategically placed journalist published an article mentioning that the company was struggling to maintain liquidity. A subtle report, no direct accusations, but enough to plant doubt in investors' minds. The effect was immediate. During lunch, Raphael received a call, and the color drained from his face. The investors are worried. Someone is spreading rumors. I took a sip of my wine calmly. Rumors are often born from hidden truths. He looked at me, suspicious. Do you know something? The question was direct, but his voice carried no accusation, only desperation. What he wanted wasn't an answer, but comfort, a guarantee that everything would be fine. Your parents refused to accept reality. Now reality is collecting its debt. At that moment, I realized he still didn't understand. He thought this was just another setback, a passing storm. But it wasn't. By the afternoon, the first major contract was canceled. The Japanese supplier that had worked with Faraz for years backed out, citing sector instability. The excuse was vague, but the damage was done. When Adelino found out, he was furious. This is a conspiracy. Someone is sabotaging the company. Esther sat in the office, her eyes wide, gripping the phone like it was a lifeline. Her breathing was unsteady. For the first time, I saw fear in her eyes. I wanted them to feel this, the insecurity, the doubt. The lack of control, but it still wasn't enough. The phone calls didn't stop. The finance department warned that banks were reevaluating their loans. Longtime clients hesitated to sign new contracts. Everything was happening exactly as I had planned. Then came the final blow. By late afternoon, one of the company's main creditors requested an urgent audit, an unexpected request, but entirely within their rights. I knew what this meant. They would find the irregularities. They would uncover the masked numbers, the hidden debts, and when that happened, there would be no way back. When Raphael came home that night, his eyes were hollow, as if he had aged 10 years in a single day. "We're losing everything," he murmured. I didn't reply. The fall wasn't complete yet, but it was close, very close. They still didn't know that this would be their last night before disaster. The clock struck 3 in the morning when the knocks on the door echoed through the apartment. They weren't hesitant taps, but desperate, impatient pounding, as if someone were drowning, and this was their last chance to breathe. I was already awake. I knew this moment would come. I got up without haste, feeling the weight of the night settle on my shoulders. The house was steeped in absolute silence, broken only by the insistent knocking. I walked down the hallway, my bare feet against the cold floor, and unlocked the door. Esther and Adelino stood before me. What I saw was no longer the proud, imposing business people who commanded meetings like generals. Before me stood only 2 defeated people, consumed by the ruin that had fallen upon them. Esther's hair was disheveled, her eyes red and sunken, as if she hadn't slept in days. Adelino held a phone in his hand, but his fingers trembled so much he could barely keep it steady. "Isadora, please." Esther's voice was unrecognizable, weak, broken. I didn't answer. I just stared at them. Adelino opened his mouth, but no words came out. Perhaps for the first time in his life, he didn't know what to say. It was Esther who broke first. "You have to help us," she pleaded. "The company. We're about to lose everything. The creditors have already frozen our accounts. The bank canceled our credit line. If we don't do something by tomorrow, we'll be officially declared bankrupt." The tomorrow they feared so much had already been written. My eyes moved from one to the other. How ironic it was to see them there, at my door, kneeling before the same woman they had called an opportunist and a gold digger just days ago. "I warned you," I murmured, crossing my arms. Adelino finally seemed to find his voice. "We can negotiate," he said, his tone trying to sound firm, but failing miserably. I know we can still be saved. You have the right contacts. Talk to them. Convince them that we still have a plan. My smile was cold. You don't have a plan. You never did. And now you have nothing left. Desperation spilled across Esther's face like invisible tears. She clasped her hands together as if praying, as if there was still a God who could reverse the inevitable. "Please, Isadora," she whispered. The irony was bitter. They humiliated me when I tried to help them. They pushed me away when I tried to save them. And now, at the end, when nothing remained, they stood before me, stripped of their pride, begging for a mercy I would never deny them. Because there was never mercy. There was only justice. I took a step forward and studied them. Carefully. This moment belonged to them. It was important that they felt the weight of their actions, the bitter taste of spitting on the hand that had once offered them help. "Now do you understand?" My voice was calm, almost sweet. "You don't spit on the hand that offers help." Adelino fell to his knees. His face twisted in the despair he had been trying to hide for days. But it was already too late. Faraz Imports' bankruptcy had been declared. Their world had ended, and mine was only just beginning. The next morning, the newspapers were relentless. The headlines screamed Faraz Imports' bankruptcy like a public spectacle. Empire collapses, the rise and fall of a legacy, and Faraz Imports declares insolvency were just a few of the titles flooding financial news sites. Experts discussed the abrupt downfall. Analysts explained how the company had crumbled under market pressure. What no one knew was that the ruin hadn't been accidental. It was calculated. Raphael walked into the apartment just after noon. His face was haggard, his eyes sunken from days without sleep. He gripped his phone so tightly his fingers had turned white. "You did this," he said. It wasn't a question. I took a sip of my coffee, unbothered. I only sped up the inevitable. "Why?" His voice wavered, thick with disbelief. The question was ridiculous. He knew the answer. He had always known. "Because no one humiliates me and gets away with it, Raphael." He shook his head, letting out a humorless laugh. He paced the room like a cornered animal, his nerves on edge. "And now? What did you gain from this? What do you want? For me to kneel like them? For me to beg?" I stood up and walked over to the table where a white envelope rested. I picked it up carefully and placed it in front of him. "I want you to sign this." Raphael looked at the envelope, as if it were a bomb about to explode. With hesitant fingers, he opened it and pulled out the contents. The divorce papers. His eyes met mine, filled with a mix of pain and indignation. "You decided this before everything started, didn't you?" "Yes." He laughed again, but this time there was something broken in his laughter. "You never loved me." I sighed, feeling for the first time a flicker of nostalgia. That wasn't true. I had loved him once, but love doesn't survive where there is neglect, where there is silence in the face of injustice. "You never protected me," I corrected. And in the end, we were never on the same side. He didn't answer. He just picked up the pen and signed. When he handed me the papers, I saw that the shock had finally hit him. For the first time, Raphael was truly alone. But I wasn't, because I still had one final move to make. And when he found out, he would realize that losing the company hadn't been the worst part. There was still something greater, something he never imagined I was capable of taking. The wind blew cold at the top of the building, but I felt nothing except the quiet satisfaction filling every part of me. The city stretched out below my feet, alive and pulsating, indifferent to the collapse of the Faraz family. Faraz Imports was now nothing more than a bitter memory in the newspapers. Bankruptcy had been officially declared that morning, and their assets had started going up for auction to pay off debts. The mansion where Adelino and Esther had hosted countless lavish parties would be sold in a matter of days. The sports cars, the jewelry, everything was disappearing. They tried to fight back. Adelino threatened to sue investors, ranted about sabotage, desperately tried to convince the bank to reverse the restrictions. But no one listens to a broken man. Esther vanished from social media and, according to rumors, was staying at a distant cousin's house, avoiding the judgmental stares of old friends. They didn't know how to live without status, without money, without the respect that, in the end, was never real. And Raphael? He tried to rebuild. He tried to use what little credibility he had left to start a new business. But without the weight of his last name and the family's capital, he finally saw what he had always denied. He had no talent for business. He was just a reflection of his parents, a man who believed he was powerful simply because power had always surrounded him. Now, with nothing, he was just another failure among many. As for me, I didn't just survive. I was reborn. Months before. Their complete downfall, while the Faraz family still believed they were in control, I had quietly bought up all of the company's debts. I waited for the right moment to claim what was mine. With the bankruptcy declared, I became the sole owner of what was left of Faraz Imports, a tarnished name stripped of credibility. But that didn't matter to me. I would rebuild it my way, under my leadership, without carrying the weight of a family that had destroyed its own legacy. I renamed the company, erasing every trace of the Faraz name. It didn't take me years to make it grow. Just the right decisions, the right alliances, and the talent they always claimed I didn't have. Now, my new company thrived, and there, at the top of my building, with the city stretching beneath me, I realized I no longer felt anger. I no longer felt resentment. Only an unshakable certainty that everything had happened exactly as it was meant to. I thought about the Faraz family, the name I had once tried to honor, the people who rejected me, the insults I had swallowed. And then I smiled. They no longer existed, but I did. And in the end, that was all that mattered.